Hello, everybody. It's my second time in Korea, and I'm delighted to be here. I've come back with a great pleasure. So thank you for the organizer for inviting me. Now, you may wonder why an Italian is about to entertain you about female employment, since Italy is still a low employment country and has been up till recently one of the lowest fertility countries in the world. So apparently doesn't have much to teach. But actually, I'm not here as representative of my own country, although there are always lessons to be learned, even from countries that don't perform so well. But I'm here because I've been an expert on female employment for a very long time for the European Commission, and I'm still leading a network of experts from all member states on this particular issue. Now, however, allow me to be the ambassador of my own country, not so much for female employment, but for other reasons. It's a beautiful country, and also to let you know where I come from, which is always good with foreigners. At least you learn who is talking to you. I come from a city called Siena, and you see quite an impressive picture here. It's one of the best preserved medieval city in the world, and some believe it's a beautiful city. And the second reason why it is well known is for a peculiarity that it has a horse race, which is very famous, called the Palio, which is run inside the city, in fact, in the main square of the city. And if you look closely at the picture, you can notice that there are horses in a sort of in the circle that has been built into the square, and a lot of people gathering, of course, a lot of tourists gathering for the event. So if you want to know something about my city, I'll be here after my talk. Here I've been actually asked to talk about the part-time approach in the European Union to increase female employment. And before I get to that, which is really the meat of my presentation, probably the only thing I'll be able to talk about, let me tell you, however, that this is not the only strategy in the European Union. There are at least 3 pivots to the strategy to increase female employment in Europe. One is childcare, which I will not talk about. Another is part-time, and the emphasis on part-time has been the latest sort of development in the European strategy. And companion to the part-time is the fiscal approach, which I was hoping to be able to talk about in my presentation, but I'm not sure I'll get there, because I usually take much longer than I plan to get to the end of a presentation, and here I only have 20 minutes. Part-time. Now, the reason why I'm talking here about part-time is partly in this picture. You can see here the depiction of an index number on employment in the European Union, and the blue line is the part-time employment growth since basically 2000 up to the present, and the brown line is full-time. As you can see, the growth of part-time exceeds by far that of full-time. And in fact, it's important to bear in mind also to understand what follows, that there are 2 periods that you should distinguish. One is pre-crisis, meaning pre-2008, and another is from 2008 to 2012, because of course there has been a substantial increase in part-time before the crisis, but also full-time employment was more slowly, but still also growing. With the crisis, what has happened is full-time employment has fallen, partly in favor of part-time, and one of the reasons you've heard this morning is because of job sharing, basically. So you have to keep in mind this, this sort of period, two periods picture. Right. Among the countries that contributed to part-time increases are some of the largest countries in Europe. And among those countries feature Germany, for one, but also Italy and Spain. You can see this in this graph because the blue part of the bar will tell you the share of part-time employment within female employment before the crisis, and the maroon bit, the maroon bar, bit of the bar, tells you the increase, sorry, the blue part of the bar will tell you the level of part-time employment in 2000. The maroon part of the bar will tell you the increase between 2000 and 2007, and the green part of the bar will tell you the increase or the decrease after the 2007, meaning during the crisis. So what we are concerned here is what, which countries, in which countries part-time grew most after 2000. And as you can see that, I mean, you can check that by looking at the height of the maroon part of the bar. And you can see that this is largest in countries that were circled, like Italy and Germany. I also circled Denmark, as you can see, where, however, there was no increase, practically no increase in part-time between 2000 and 2007. There was a small increase during the crisis, but nevertheless, the share of part-time in total female employment is and remains fairly high. Right, so this slide was basically to tell you that among the countries contributing most to part-time is two of the countries that I'll talk about, and one is Italy, another is Germany. I'll also talk about Denmark. I'll tell you that in a moment. Because in a way, as I will argue towards the end of the presentation, in Denmark, in my opinion, there is one of the best ratio between quantity of female employment and quality of female employment. And that is the reason why I'll be talking about the Danish model, although Denmark, as I repeat, has not contributed to the increase in part-time lately. It has always had a high share of women working part-time. Now, in order to understand what is behind this increase in part-time, and in particular, what is good and what is not so good, then I'll compare three models, the countries circle. And the countries are Germany, Italy, Denmark, as I said. Before coming to the comparison, however, it's important to set the scene. Now, in every European country, part-time law has to abide by a supranational law, which is called EU directive, and the EU directive on part-time was issued and came to force in 1997. What this slide is about, the most important point the most important characteristics of the supranational, call it law, in any case regulation, that the European Commission has basically imposed on all members. And there are two key points to look at. One is equal treatment of part-timers and full-timers, right? And I'll explain what that means in a moment. And the second is that the directive asks for the removal of obstacles that impede workers to transfer from full-time to part-time and conversely. Okay? Let me comment a second on the equal treatment for part-timers and full-timers. That means, of course, not they are paid the same in terms of period earnings, but they should be paid the same for equivalent work pro rata. And they should have the access to the same rights. So they have access to sick pay, holiday, benefits, health insurance, whatever is the right of full-time workers should also be the right of part-time workers. Whenever there is a matter of compensation involved, that compensation should be pro rata. That's basically what the EU directive says, and as I said, at least on paper, this should have been enforced by all European countries since about 1997. Having said that, what are the different model and the different pattern? Here is Denmark. Denmark is a high female employment country. You can see that it has a 70% employment rate, so it is there where Korea wants to go. Okay? Whereas the average for the EU 27 is still 62.4. Denmark is also a relatively high part-time work country for women. The part-time share is 36% compared to 31% for the EU. But as you can see, the trend is fairly stable. Well, I mean, stable in the sense that if you look now, blue is part-time work for women, and brown, maroon, is for full-time work for women. And as you can see, from the 90 until present, part-time work has been oscillating, but basically the trend is stable. Full-time work has been increasing. That's one of the few countries in Europe where the full-time share of work for women is tendentially increasing, although, of course, the crisis has stopped this increase, as you can see from here. Now, the most important thing to note about Denmark is it is a high, stable, part-time work country. What are the regulations in Denmark? Having said that they didn't change much lately. Part-time work is an option, not a right. There are very few countries in Europe where part-time is a right, meaning that the employee can ask for part-time work and needs to be granted by the employer. The Netherlands is one such country. Denmark is not. The EU part-time directive is enforced with the implication I just told you. And that means that part-time employees are entitled to part-time unemployment insurance. Concerning pensions, part-time workers' contributions and benefit are proportional to working time. As I said before, there is a pro rata principle that holds. In Denmark, there are still some limitations concerning recruitment, meaning, for example, there are some regulation on the maximum number of part-time workers which are set by collective agreements, but this notwithstanding, I repeat, the part-time share is quite high. And all in all, part-time work is well accepted in Denmark, is thought to be normal work, except with reduced hours. It's well accepted by firms and by employees. It has a long-standing tradition, as you have seen. Let's look at another model now, Germany. Germany has become a high female employment country recently, and as you can see, the employment rate is 68% basically, but it is one now of the highest, second only to the Netherlands, part-time work country for women. The part-time work for women is almost half, right? The if you look again at the blue line and that maroon line, you can notice perhaps that there was an acceleration in the blue line after the Hartz reform, which took place, was enforced around 2004. That is relevant because I'll talk about the Hartz reform now and what it has done for part-time, or rather for one section of part-time employment. In Germany, these are the regulation, of course, very, very much in brief. There are two types of part-time. One is the insured part-time, and the other is mini-jobs. Now, insured part-time is any kind of employment, not on a full-time basis, of course, that is above 400 euros per month. In fact, starting from 2013, the threshold has been raised to 450 per month. Below, let's say 400, because all my data refer to 2012, so I prefer to refer to the old threshold, which is 400 euros per month. Below this threshold, a job is called informally mini-job, a very small job, because with 400 euros per month, you work normally an average of 15 hours around. Okay? So it's a very small job. Now, the number of mini-jobs exceeds that of insured part-time position. You will see why insured in a moment. Okay? So the mini-jobs are very important. They are practically half of all part-time positions in Germany. If we take the insured part-time, Germany is not very different from other European countries in the sense that so-called regular, insured, normal part-time work is regulated by, of course, the EU directives, among others, and there are, the equal treatment clause and all that. Okay? What is different is the mini-jobs. The mini-jobs were introduced in the late 60s as one way to draw married women into the labor market. Okay? So they have a long-standing tradition, as you can see. They are not a new phenomenon. But they were reformed substantially within the so-called Hartz reform package, right? And the two things that matter most in the reform was that the pay threshold rose from, at that time, around 2003, 2004, from 325 euros to 400 euros. And, that's very important, there was previously an hour ceiling, meaning that a mini-job could not be a mini-job if the working hours were more than 15 per week. Now, that ceiling has been removed. So there is no hour ceiling, basically, which made it more attractive to both employers and employees. Now, and following the Hartz reform, in fact, in the span of 2 years, the mini-jobs increased by 1 millions. Well, the figures vary depending on the source, but roughly this is the order of magnitude. So a spectacular increase, and that is the acceleration in the part-time growth that you have seen in the previous slide. Now, why this growth? Because mini-jobs are apparently attractive to both the employees and the employers. What is the source of attraction for the employee? Well, the employee basically gets, suppose that he or she, mostly a she, gets 400 euros per month, right? She can cash it all, pays no security, no taxes, but has some rights, nevertheless, which you can see on the slide, like entitlement to holiday, sick pay, and on paper, other employment rights. De facto, that's more debated. Okay? Attractiveness for the employers. Well, the employer pay something towards Social Security. In fact, some argue that this flat rate of 30% is even higher in some cases than the average the employers pay for other jobs, right? But nevertheless, they find mini jobs attractive. Why? They are very flexible. You can understand without any limit in the hours worked or in the type of schedule to be agreed between employee and employer. And at least, trade unions insist, but that's the only source that we have available, that they are very, very low-paid jobs. I'll give the figure later, but between 80%, that's an estimate, between 80 and 90% of mini jobs are so-called low-paid jobs, right? So that's an attraction in the sense that the employer knows that he or she saves on the cost of such jobs. Now, let's look at Italy as the last instance, the last case study. And as you can see here, from 1990 to 2012, basically, from this picture, you could learn that the only growth that was there was in part-time employment, right? And no growth in full-time employment. Actually, this picture, it's the official Eurostat data, so I've kept it, right? But there are some problems, like national sources will tell you that there was some growth in full-time jobs and a lesser growth in part-time jobs. Nevertheless, it remains true that the growth in part-time jobs somehow is spectacular compared to that of full-time jobs. And in fact, this growth has brought Italy from being a country where, like in Korea, part-time was thought as a sort of secondary option, if not to say an option that was looked upon with some, doubts. So from being a country where part-time was not encouraged, neither by government nor by unions, and not even by firms, because in the past, firms found it costly because there was a particular social security requirement whereby the contributions that firms paid towards pension for part-timers was higher on a pro rata basis than those from full-timers. So nobody seemed to want part-time in Italy at one point, right? And from then on, from when it was reformed in the early 90s, you can see that it grew sort of steadily until 2003, and then there is an acceleration, and there is another reform that's, if you want, the equivalent in Italy of the Hartz reform. I wouldn't say the equivalent, but, well, roughly, and that's called the Biagi reform, that has introduced a lot of flexibility in the labor market and has deregulated part-time. We'll see now what this regulation consists of and why it has been found so attractive for some of the people who wanted to work part-time and before, found less part-time jobs, but has been found attractive especially for employers who have offered a lot more of part-time jobs. So what's the deregulation about? 5 minutes, thank you. The regulation is the following, that employer now, for a part-time work contract, can vary the schedule, not entirely at their will, but they have substantial leeway in varying the schedule of work, and they can ask for extra hours if the employees agrees, of course. Now, that's very important for small firms, because typically small firms have a problem in having peaks of demands and troughs of product demand. And so they want to somehow adjust the hours to their product schedule. And the fact that part-time gives this flexibility to them was important and explains why it grew. Now, what are the pros and cons? I have 5 minutes, and so I'll be brief. Main known advantages. Well, we have seen the advantages here, mostly, meaning that part-time work has been recently, as partly at least intended by the European Commission, one way to effectively tap women's supply. But it has tapped the women's supply at the so-called extensive margin rather than the intensive margin. I mean, the most prominent example is, of course, Germany, where a lot of the part-time jobs were for very, very small number of hours, right? And in fact, the number of hours in Germany has fallen because of that lately. Another advantage is that it is universally recognized to facilitate reconciliation between work and family life. Main drawbacks, there are several. The part-timers tend to be concentrated in just a limited number of jobs, frequently non-highly skilled, and therefore low-paid, or medium to low-paid, that depends, okay? There is, on a pro rata basis, there tends to be a higher pay-gender gap, meaning if you work part-time, you are more likely to be paid less compared to a man who works part-time than, if 2 full-timers, male and females, are compared, right? So there is a pay penalty for part-time, on average. There are exceptions to that, obviously. One other drawback is that it tends to accumulate disadvantages towards pension income for women, and I've been recently compiling the first European study on the gender pension gap, and the gap, meaning the percentage difference between men and women in pension, is much higher throughout Europe for pension than it is for pay. It's very, very high, and in countries like Germany, it tends to be one of the highest and reaches above 40%, about 48%. So that is one drawback that one needs to sort of pay attention to. As I said, there tends to be, with marginal forms of part-times, a very high incidence of low pay. Also, it's while things like mini-jobs have effectively tapped some of women's supply and even of men's supply, right? It's not clear where they act as a bridge, meaning there are ways in which you draw people that otherwise wouldn't be in the labor market, you draw people inside the labor market, but then eventually the same people, say women, will find more regular jobs, insured jobs, sort of proper types of jobs, right? So there is question mark whether mini-job act as a bridge rather than producing segmentation, meaning a sharp division between people, usually men, that may work long hours, and married women who work a very small amount of hours. And last but not least, in some countries, involuntary part-time can be high. So here is the last thing that I want to show. There is more in my presentation, but I won't have time to go into. And if you look at the bars here, the blue bar is the share of involuntary part-time in 2007, just before the crisis. The maroon bar is the share of involuntary part-time in now, 2012, so as an effect of the crisis. And of course, as you would expect, the maroon bar is much higher because the crisis has produced a lot of job sharing, which is not exactly voluntary, although it's not a bad thing, because it has saved jobs. I mean, it has reduced the number of layoffs. But what is important here is to contrast, like, the usual countries. If you look at Italy, which is to your right, okay, it has an arrow, so you can identify it quickly. I don't have a pointer here. Okay? Then you can see something has appeared, and I hope it will go. Good? right? So if you look at here, you can see that Italy has a very high share of involuntary part-time, and it was high even before the crisis, about 1/3, which is not, it's not a marginal segment of part-timers. These are women that would have liked to work longer. So when you implement a reform of part-time, one of the indicators that you must bear in mind is, am I producing voluntary or involuntary part-time? Now, perhaps the kind of deregulation that has happened in Italy was good to mobilize the female labor force, but as a drawback, it probably produced more part-time that was wanted by the female labor force. And the share of involuntary part-time is an indicator. If you look, and here again, I come to my close with comparing models. If you look at Denmark instead, the share of involuntary part-time has always been, is there, is not negligible, but before the crisis it was around 15%. After the crisis, now it's slightly more than 20%, still not negligible, but on the whole, it is low. So Denmark manages to be high part-time countries with a low involuntary part-time. Involuntary part-time is low even in Germany, right? So if we had to sort of compare the models and really, be very simplistic, as, my time only allows me to be, then I would say in Germany, you have a low, very low share of very low paid part-timers among women, who may have troubles, if only at old age, if they don't have it now, right? There are some other consequences that I won't go into. So that is a concern, although the German model was the most successful in mobilizing the female labor force, right? So that's a drawback. In Italy, again, success in mobilizing the part-timers, success in having at least one share of employment growth, but again, with the drawback of producing a substantial share of involuntary part-time, okay? So in a way, the model that has produced less drawback ends up being the Danish model. And I'll close here because I think I've just one more thing. The last part of the slides, which you'll have on paper, deal with the fact that in the proper implementation of a part-time design, you can't simply think of part-time. You have to think also of the fiscal side, the fiscal treatment of workers, because it's very important for ensuring that a part-time job is a bridge and not a gap, right? And you have also to bear in mind that if you want full-time employment, full-time female employment correlates best with the coverage of childcare throughout Europe. Okay, that's a slide I won't show, but I have it for whoever is interested. So, thank you.